Hello, my name is John Ball, photographer John Ball. I am excited to present to you the evolution and origins of my portfolio titled My Private Idaho. I've been working on this portfolio for about 8 years, off and on, but it's been a pretty steady effort over these 8 years to develop something that expresses my feelings and my own thoughts about Idaho. Of course, Idaho is known for its natural beauty, and I know that, and everyone knows that. But I really wanted to encapsulate the areas in my area in near Boise, Idaho, that I feel connected to. Everyone has connections to locations and places that they visit or places they live with for different reasons. Everyone's are personal. And these places that I photograph here, they are places I go with my camera, I go without my camera, and I photograph them. But it didn't start that way. I was born in eastern Idaho, which is much different from western Idaho, where Boise is located. Eastern Idaho is about 2,000 to 3,000 feet higher in elevation. It's a lot colder in the winter and in the summer, and just a lot more wind and a lot more, sour weather, you might say. But as a kid, I didn't care. Here I am, probably in the spring. This looks like May or April. Um, Standing in the front yard, my mom took my picture. And you never know, what happens to little kids. At that time, I was, 6 years old, and I had a really strong appetite for art and for making art. Of course, I didn't know it at the time. It was just stuff I was doing, but I was constantly making paper airplanes and mud sculptures and drawings and anything I could to create. And that was great. But in Eastern Idaho at that time, there weren't a lot of options if you wanted to be an artist. If you wanted to take art classes or do anything unique, that wasn't happening. It was a pretty basic school. So if you didn't play basketball or football or uh, do farming or wrestling, you just were excluded from the things that the school could offer you. And my parents, who, grew up in Eastern Idaho, in fact, my dad was sixth generation Idahoan. I'm seventh. My kids are eighth, but he and his siblings grew up in Rexburg in Eastern Idaho. Their ancestors, or my ancestors, came from England in the 1870s. They moved to Utah to escape religious persecution. They joined the Mormon Church in England, and then they were part of the pioneers that came across to the west. And they settled in Eastern Idaho, which is just north of Utah, and they established towns and roads. They were shepherds, and who would have thought that some generations later, their great grandson would be interested in art and interested in things that they had no freedom to do. But anyway, here I am in 1979 in Eastern Idaho. My family moved to Boise, Idaho in 1984. I was 11 years old, and I was entering the sixth grade that fall. This picture is really representative of the group because we're all clearly presented. These studio portraits are good for that. Olin Mills was the studio that we took this photograph in, this portrait. Of course, none of us wanted to do it, get dressed up and go down and do it, but we did it anyway. And anyway, this is where families got their family portraits done. This is before my youngest brother was born. He was born in 85. But everyone in here is still around. Everyone's still alive. They live in this area, all of them. Everyone has kids and spouses and busy lives. But here we are, almost, well, actually longer than 40 years ago. Something profound happened to me in sixth grade. It was 1986. And my teacher, who was a photographer in college, set up a dark room in the utility closet of the classroom. I'd never heard of a darkroom. I'd never seen a darkroom, but she wanted to give her students the opportunity to experiment with photography. So she had cameras that we could take pictures with, and she also had this darkroom. So if we were good in class and did our homework and did the things we were supposed to do, she gave us the privilege of spending an hour at a time in the darkroom. She took this picture with a 35 millimeter camera and had just a binder full of negatives, and we could go through them and print them as we wanted. So I printed this photograph in 1986 in the darkroom in my 6th grade class. So that's me in the far side, the figure there. And I remember all the boys in this picture, Rodney, and anyway, all the guys. This picture was really important to me because I had this tremendous creative urge that I wanted to find a route for, but I was fairly impatient. I didn't have the patience to really draw carefully or paint or sculpt. So photography was beautiful for me. It was, if you have a desire to be creative and you have an impatient streak in you, photography is great. I pursued photography very actively from 6th grade on. And in early parts of high school, I was very active in the darkroom. I remember walking to the school early in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, with a pocket full of film to process from the day before, whether I was taking pictures of my girlfriend's cat or my friends or anything that I was taking photographs of. This particular picture is Julie, my girlfriend's cat. My buddy Dane and I went over, and the assignment was to photograph an animal. So we found her cat, and we took pictures of him laying there and walking around. And then we had this idea to get a picture of him flying through the air. So Dane tossed him from the deck out onto the grass, and I took this kitty cat's photograph many times. This happened to be the best one. The cat was never harmed. Nothing ever happened. He just walked off. But this picture was hanging in the hallway at Capitol High School for many years, actually. I think 2 years. Here's another picture that was fairly successful in high school. This is an exploding egg. My buddy Brent and I set up a studio in our garage, and I lined my camera up pretty close with a flash, and he took photos. Or no, he shot his gun while I took photos. So we'd count down 3, 2, 1. He'd shoot his 22 at an egg, and I would take a picture with a flash. It was a messy operation, but we sure had fun. I'm shocked my parents let us do that. We shot the bullet into a bunch of sandbags, and this was the best picture that I got. It's kind of a mess, but we really enjoyed it at the time. Here's the same garage experimenting with flash, probably around the same time, although it must have been after the egg because you can see the egg splatters all over the walls. I also really enjoyed taking pictures of people. Here's my buddy Tom. He was a bass player in the jazz choir, and it was so much fun to take these pictures and go downtown. And this particular picture was the most famous, quote unquote, famous picture of my early career. This picture hung in the halls at Capitol High for quite a while. And I still have the copy, and Tom is still my friend. Things like that happen. Another thing I was doing all as much as possible was just walking around with my camera and taking photos of things that I found interesting. This was on a choir. I was in the choir trip to San Francisco from Boise. I didn't know at the time I was doing documentary or street photography. I was just taking pictures, and here's one in 1990. I also love photographing my friends. So whenever we were bored, they would get some, we'd drive downtown or go somewhere, and I'd just start taking pictures of them. This is my buddy Dane, and he was the one that was working with me on the cat picture. Here's my buddy Dan in a similar location downtown. We just walked around and took pictures. It was so much fun. Here's another picture that was just a little bit later. We took a trip to the Oregon coast from Boise. It's about an 11-hour drive. And I stood on this area and I just took pictures of things as they happened in front of me. This was, I thought, was pretty successful with the trail from the stroller creating a line up to the top right corner. I thought this picture was fun. In addition to photography, I was really into mountain biking. Boise sits in a valley that's pretty big, and on the edges of the valley are these foothills. So there's like the mountains, with the trees and really steep and granite. And then underneath those or below those are foothills, which are essentially sand hills that we rode our mountain bikes on through trails. This is before mountain biking was really anything. It was pretty primitive at this time. But we sure had a great time riding our bikes around and having a good time. I got a picture of myself in the yearbook jumping or doing a bunny hop um, over a bale of hay. But this experience and this time was really formative for me because I became very enchanted with the foothills. And even back then, I really wanted to take pictures of the foothills in the area, but I just kind of lacked the organizational skills. If I was going to go to the foothills, I was going to be mountain biking. But regardless, this is kind of where my love of the local area started. In fact, I even got a picture. This is part of my high school senior pictures with my Kona bike. That bike's probably worth a lot these days, but it's been long gone. Anyway, this was where I started. I was a lover of the outdoors. I was vigorous, very curious about a lot of things, but mostly curious about photography and mountain biking. And I didn't realize at the time, and I only learned this a few years ago. Here's a map of southwestern Idaho. On the bottom left corner, you can see this. That's the corner of Idaho where that line is. Those two lines that come together in that corner. And it says you are here. That indicates where I am in Boise right now, right at the edge of the foothills. Before Boise existed, before any of this existed, some 10 million years ago, Lake Idaho existed. And it was a really large, big lake that stretched all the way from near Twin Falls, which is about 100 miles from my home, clear into Oregon, Vail, Nissa, this area. It was a very large, deep lake that stayed there for millions of years. In fact, the Idaho State Capitol building would be under 1,100 feet of water 2 million years ago. So in that time, this massive lake just existed. And as it existed, the wind would blow sand and debris off the mountains into the north and the south. And that stuff would land on the shore of the mountain or of the lake and settle down to the bottom of the lake. And that created a big flat valley, mostly flat. I mean, it surely has contours, but I didn't realize at the time where the foothills actually had come from, but they had come from this Lake Idaho. And all the mountains just to the north of where it says you are here, they drained the snow and the rain into the lake and made massive foothills and contours that were underwater until sometime I'll talk about what happened. But this is the top of Lake Idaho. This was never underwater. This is Table Rock. It's just north of Boise. I don't know who took this picture, but I've been up there lots and lots of times. It's got this really nice sandstone cliffs. You can see the ones in the front, but in the back, they're quite large. Well, about 2 million years ago or so, the Lake Idaho broke, or the northwestern edge of that lake breached its shores and started to drain violently out of the lake. And they say, and they theorize that that's how Hell's Canyon was formed, through the draining of Lake Idaho. And if you go to Hell's Canyon, you can see it must have been something dramatic that created that canyon. This is just part of that canyon. I was there in May of 22. But the foothills around Boise look like this. Very contoured, pretty foothills. Of course, not everyone thinks that. Most people like pine trees and an alpine environment. But I think that the foothills and the desert environments have their own beauty. This is a spot just north of my house, maybe like 20 minutes on the road. And it's now been turned into a neighborhood, which is a heartbreaker for me. But it's a good example of the flowing, beautiful nature of the foothills around Boise. Here's another photo I took just not too far from the other one. But these foothills are a really, really nice resource for all the local people. There's very large system of trails for hiking and walking and riding bikes that everyone around here really enjoys. And in the early 90s, the foothills. I think it's called the Boise Foothill Coalition or something. They created um, a group that started buying up the foothills and giving them to the public. And I'm so thankful they did that, because otherwise it would have been all developed for homes. So Boise has a really large public network of trails. Here's another picture similar to the first one I showed, showing the beauty of the foothills and the way they flow. And these are some flowers that were blooming. Of course, it's black and white. You can't really tell, but they're there anyway. My photographic journey starts in, sixth grade and goes all the way through high school. And then I served a mission for the church in 92 to 94. And I came back and I felt like I needed to further my education. This was before YouTube and really any of those sorts of modern learning techniques. Back then, if you wanted to learn something, you had to either go to the library or you had to go to school for it. And the best school in the land was Brooks Institute of Photography in Santa Barbara, California. This is the outside cover of the brochure I got at that time. I visited the school in 91 when I graduated high school and became interested, but figured it was too expensive and too far away. But I had tremendous support from my family to attend that school. So in 95, I started going there, and this is what it felt like. This is what it looked like. We learned how to officially use cameras, big, large format cameras. This is the mission in Santa Barbara. It's kind of the first assignment everyone does. But you learn how to adjust and focus and get everything lined up in your view camera. And it was such a wonderful experience. 3 years there. I had just gotten married, and my wife, Samantha, and I lived down there and enjoyed that time. Brooks was great at teaching commercial photography, large format photography. You can see this big camera on this tripod in front of this guy. Of course, those are now sort of relics of the past for the most part, especially in commercial. People usually shoot digital now, but this kind of gives you an idea of the school and the magnitude. I soaked up every minute of it. Here's a photo of Sam and I in 95. We got married and moved to Santa Barbara, and this photo was taken by a fellow Brooks student for an assignment. I'm so thankful we did all these photos. But anyway, here's a photo of me using an 8x10 camera in 96 while I was in school. I mean, I just love those cameras and still do. Still love those cameras, but this is a vintage picture. I continued photographing people through my years at Brooks Institute. This is my brother Joey taken with an 8x10 camera. This was inspired by an August Sander picture. Here's a picture of me, self-portrait in 96. This was Marl Rock in Morro Bay, California. So I was continuously taking photos of landscapes and people through all of my assignments, through all the things I did. The assignments and my schoolwork was sort of secondary, honestly, to my personal work. I was mostly curious about doing that. I photographed, this is just right by Santa Barbara, Devereaux Point, where there's a lot of surfing, and it's a really beautiful area. Here's some friends of mine in 97. I started surfing with my friends while I was in California, and every day we'd go out and check the surf and see if it was a good time to go. I'm still friends here with these guys. Here we are in Arizona. We like to travel and take pictures, and here we are with this is called the Horseshoe in Arizona. This is before it was organized, and there was like a viewing platform. You could just stand right on these rocks. It's actually pretty harrowing, but it's a gorgeous spot. Here's a photo of my sister Mindy at the time. Anyone I met or knew, I'd asked to take their photo because I just thought portraits are so interesting. Here's another self-portrait. I became really interested in these twin lens cameras, medium format cameras. So I had them with me everywhere I went. But I graduated from Brooks Institute with a degree in portraiture, actually outdoor portraits, and started my photo studio. This is 98, my little studio attached to the house. And I set to work trying to earn a living with photography. So I took photos of couples and children and families in the local area. And I actually was quite successful. I had made good money and met a lot of really, really nice people. Here's some examples of that. Here's a kind of a typical photo from that era with matching outfits and all that. Anyway, I love doing all these, and the people love the photos. And I'm still friends with a lot of people. In fact, I see them around town, wave hello. And portraiture is interesting that way. It really creates a trail that you leave behind you. Sometimes I get texts from people from portraits I took, 25 years ago. I just think it's really fun that way. I tried to include my love of landscape photography with my portraits and tried to blend portraiture with landscape photography. I thought this is a successful example of that back in the day. But also along the way, I just took photos, just took pictures every day, all day. Here's my daughter Bailey being led to the playground by her grandpa. Here's a trip I took to Mexico in 2001 and photographed the boats on the shore with some infrared film. Here's my daughter Bailey in 2002. Here's my son Jack and I in 2003. I kept that little Nikon, not really little, that Nikon F3 loaded with film in the closet at all times. So if something looked good or something interesting, I'd go grab the Nikon and take a picture. I kind of got bored and burned out of outdoor portraits after a few years. So I bought a photo studio in Southern California in San Juan Capistrano that specialized in indoor studio formal portraits, sort of the exact opposite of everything I was doing in Idaho. I wanted a new challenge, and this was definitely a new challenge, working in a tight space with lots of people and forming groups and working with a big camera. We used a 5x7 view camera. It was just great fun. And I took some great pictures. This was 2007. I photographed individuals and families and kids and whatever needed, to be done. And that was just incredible to do. Here's another sample of that time. We tried to photograph without smiles, more of a soft smile, so you could look into the eyes and see the face. And I still think that's a good way. But again, throughout my commercial work, my portrait work, I was doing a lot of landscape photography. Here's a landscape picture in Southern California. It's not as easy there, I found, to photograph landscapes, but I still did it. This was at basically a freeway overpass. So I was taking these pictures, and there was like a very loud, continuous noise of cars driving over the bridge. But here's a picture of the tribe at home. There's Sam with 4 of our kids. So again, I kept a camera on a shelf and just photographed all the time. The kids working with Sam. Here's my son Jack learning to play the guitar. This picture's kind of become important because he's now he's in a band. They're a pretty successful band called Moon Owls Mages, and this is kind of where he started. Here's my daughter Bailey on the beach. I take the kids to the beach with a camera. This was actually with a large format camera. And here's me at that time with my large format camera. It was a camera built in the 20s, made of wood and leather. I actually loved that camera, but it broke. It just came apart, so I had to get rid of it. But then in 2008 and 2009, the economy in Southern California literally burned up, went straight to heck. And I was really sad about that. And hold on one second. Let me get this back. Really sad about that. Obviously, many of my friends lost their homes, and it was a terrible time. And I was forced to close the studio. I actually went bankrupt because I couldn't pay the debt on the studio I had purchased. And I moved back to Boise. So here's a photo of my brother and I working in Boise. We started a company and started to build it. And I gave up on portrait photography and haven't gone back to it since then. It's kind of a sad thing for me, but it's okay because I think I was ready for something else. And what I wanted to do is shoot landscapes, get back to where I started in photography, photographing landscapes and people and all the things. So I moved back to Boise and remembered my interest in the geography of Idaho. Here's a picture looking out from near the Table Rock area. You can see about in the middle of the picture, that's the tower for the airport. And off in the distance are the mountains of the Owyhee Mountains, Owyhee, Owhyhee. And this valley, this Boise Valley, stretches from the foothills all the way to the Owyhee Mountains. And I was very curious about that. And I did some research. And what had happened was Idaho batholith, that describes all the bedrock that's under everything here in Idaho, like lots and lots and lots of granite, and I can't remember the other rock, but anyway, the batholith is like a giant bedrock area of Boise. And what had happened to the Boise area was the Owyhee front was pulled away from the Idaho batholith in like a tectonic plate situation where they get pulled away from each other. Now, I'm not a geologist, is how I understand it. And what that did was it created a flat area. So not only was the lake sitting there, but all throughout that time, the area was being stretched like taffy between the Owyhee front and the Idaho batholith. It's probably still being created, although it's so slow you can't see it. And that is where we live, in this fertile valley that was created through these geologic processes. Another thing that really fascinated me about Boise and about Idaho in general is the Snake River. The Snake River is basically how we can live in this area. It starts in western or eastern Idaho, Wyoming. Actually, the origins of the Snake River is in Yellowstone National Park, and it flows south and then enters Idaho. But before all that, there was Lake Bonneville. So Lake Bonneville existed for a long time, and about 15 to 20,000 years ago, that lake broke through it was a lake that was filling without a outlet. So instead of draining to another river, it just emptied. Just filled and filled and filled until one day it started to go over the edges and spill over, and it tore a massive hole in this area. This is Red Rock Pass in southeastern Idaho. And this is where the Lake Bonneville broke through and flooded southern Idaho and the Snake River and cut massive canyons throughout this entire region. And this is an example of that. This is the Snake River just south of Boise. And the Bonneville flood, as it's referred to, brought all this contour to the area. These stones that you see in the foreground of this picture are remnants from that flood. These are basalt rocks that were sort of bedrock, and they were just ripped out by the flood and strewn along the shores wherever the river widened. So in the narrow canyons, you don't see these rocks. When you get to areas like this, the water would slow down a little bit and they'd settle. Can you imagine the force and the amount of water it would take to move these? And these are small rocks. There's rocks in the same area, size of vehicles and stuff. So that must have been a pretty dramatic flood. But that flood created these great canyons that I take pictures of. And I showed this picture earlier, but this is part of that whole rift and the floods and everything that happened to create the area. Here's another picture in the foothills headed up to the ski resort Bogus Basin. It shows the contours. Here's another, we've seen this one. Here's another example of an area close to where I live. This is Lucky Peak Reservoir. And you can see the contours of the land and all that. I just like that stuff. Also around us is what you would consider typical Idaho look, with alpine mountains, alpine environment with steep mountains and pine trees. So this was taken just right south of Boise at a place called Garden Valley. I was also extremely interested in the Boise River. The Boise River flows right through Boise. It's a gorgeous river. It has lots of opportunities for leisure and recreation and fishing, but I photographed it extensively throughout the last 8 years because as a child and as a teenager, when I moved here, the Boise River was a really important place for my friends and I. We would go down there and do the rope swing. We'd drive our vehicles around in the river. And this was, before it was very orderly and controlled. Now you couldn't do that. But I have so many great memories on that river. And I've photographed, I don't know, maybe 100 times with my big camera out there. Here's another picture of the same river, same area. Here's another example of photographing on the Boise River. Another area that I find really interesting is above the foothills. I call them the high foothills. There are roads going all throughout the mountains. You can drive from Boise all the way to Idaho City and other areas around here just on dirt roads. So I spent a lot of time on those dirt roads with my big camera taking pictures. Here's one of those such examples. I mentioned the Owyhee flood earlier. This is Swan Falls Reservoir. That's the dam right here on the right side of the picture. But you can see the damage that the Bonneville flood created when it went through here. But anyway, this is a really cool spot. There's another really interesting place is on top of Table Rock. Well, I mentioned that earlier. It was higher than Lake Idaho, and this was some of the granite that hangs out there. I photographed the Boise River in all conditions and all hours of the day. Here's one in the evening, just before it gets dark. Boise has great sunsets all summer. It's just positioned just perfectly to give a real long twilight and really dramatic skies. I wanted to photograph the sunset in Boise, but I wanted like a dark sky. And it's hard to get that naturally. You can do it with filters, but it never looks totally normal. So in 2016, I was photographing the foothills extensively. And I went up there every night to photograph the sunset. And there was a pretty big fire burning just north of Boise, which happens almost every summer. So the sky was full of smoke and the sun was just peeking through. So I got this picture, and this is all natural or whatever. This is not enhanced. So Boise has these great sunsets. Here's another picture on the Boise River. I liked the chaos in the riverine areas that looked ancient. This is in the evening at twilight, one of those great long twilight nights, looking down the river. This is another area that's very rough and raw. It's been undeveloped. I hope it stays that way. I hope a lot of areas on the Boise River stay that way. A lot of the river's been sort of flattened and tamed, you might say. I prefer the raw version, but here's one of those examples. Boise's surrounded with these foothills and with this rock. These particular basalt rocks were probably deposited by a glacier that came down through this valley at one point. But you can see the beautiful contours. This land actually sold, and there's a house there and a bunch of other stuff, which is, again, kind of sad for me. Here's another view of that same area. Someone had put a little shed there. The Boise River was good also in the smoke. So when the smoke rolls in during August, I get down there and photograph it as much as I can, because what it does is it creates separation from the background to the foreground. Without that smoke, the background trees would be the same tone as the foreground trees, and it would just be a lot of competition. So whenever there's smoke in the air, I go down to the river or go somewhere and get a picture. Just outside of Boise also, there is the Boise River, and its headwaters come down from these mountains. And this is a particularly dramatic scene where it twists and turns and creates all sorts of really interesting contours. So this was another really awesome place in Boise. And this picture is actually my top seller. I've sold a lot of these, but for obvious reasons, it's pretty spectacular. This is another shot of the Boise foothills. I spent days and days hiking the foothills with my big camera. And this is one of those pictures. We've seen that one. So I spent a lot of time exploring the area I live. I visited the places in these images many times. Sometimes I go with my camera, sometimes without. I have a personal connection to them. They're my own private Idaho. Thank you.